am super pumped to bring you one of our last sessions, which is Inquiry in PE Roundtable, Questioning Tips, Tricks, and Personal Experiences. My name is Sarah Gitchier-Hartman, and I'm a middle school physical educator in St. Louis, Missouri in the United States, and I'm a member of the Physedagogy and Phys Ed Summit teams. I am so pumped to bring this session to you because a few months ago, I actually reached out to Seth Martin and I said, you know what, buddy, you're super interested in inquiry. You've got to get a group of people together to talk about what that is. And I think that inquiry is a topic that's very popular, at least in the Twitter phys ed community right now. But like, how do we actually do it? And how do teachers actually figure out what questions they're going to ask their students? And so hopefully I think those things will get answered today. Just a couple reminders, if we have any technical difficulties during the session, we will take care of it for you and we will communicate with you through the tiles that'll keep you updated. So take it away, everybody.
All right, so just a basic introduction, again, going off of what Sarah said. We started having a conversation. We really started of even like, okay, you know, approaches, all those things, like, what do we do? But also it's like, man, we've done sessions revolving around this, but you know, what is it that people really need to learn about, or what do they really need to start getting comfortable with? And what do they need to know? And over that to them. And we both agreed that inquiry and the process and understanding what inquiry truly is was a huge part of it. And it was something that people really needed. And so I think the goal of today's session is definitely to where we can help you start off, get you going as you begin your journey, and then hopefully follow up and find ways to support you. We are going to have points between every topic where there's actually a slide for questions. So if you want to keep the Tazo active with questions that you've had in your head about inquiry in general, and just put those in, and then when those slides come up that we're seeing that, you know, Sarah sees or Jorge sees, that we'll bring those up and we'll try to them, or at least share our thoughts in regards to those things. And with that, I think we're going to begin our presentation. And we're actually going to be starting out with Dr. Harvey and Dr. Gleddie in regards to what actually is inquiry.
Stephen, you're muted.
Sorry about that.
That's all right.
What a schoolboy error, we say in England. Crikey. We've got the slideshow going, so you'll be able to follow along. So I'm Dr. Harvey. I work at now Ohio University in Athens, Ohio, where I live in Columbus. Dr. Gleddie is also helping me. Dr. Gleddie, are you there? So we're going to talk a little bit about in PE and what it is, because you know, it's a broader concept than say like just tactical games or teaching games for understanding. But obviously that is one of the models where you would be able to use and generate inquiry within your physical education programs. So first of all, the sort of Metzler, when he talks about models, if we're on slide 3, he always talks about, well, what is the big idea of the model? So a big idea of peer teaching is obviously I teach you, you teach me. So the big idea in inquiry is that the learner is situated as a problem solver. And Metzler talks about this thing about think and move. So it's a way of setting problems for the young people that we're teaching, and then getting them to construct and reconstruct those problems while moving around in the gymnasium or on the field, wherever the activity is taking place. He's got a slide later on where he talks about another kind of phases of inquiry, but Artigue and colleagues, some French researchers, have talked about inquiry as a 4-phase process that could happen throughout a lesson. So the first phase is this notion of problem setting or problematization, giving the students the opportunity to make hypotheses about the different things in which they're inquiring into. time for testing and investigation, which would be where there would be thinking and then moving. And then there would be time to, again, physically do a demonstration and come to a conclusion about a specific problem at the end of the class. I'm not going to give too many examples on this process, because maybe when we get to the practical examples later, we can sort of go through and talk about how this process might be used within those practical examples. In his so Metzler 2011, it's his instruction models in physical education book, and there's some resources at the end of the presentation which teachers and coaches will be able to use. But Metzler talks about 3 theories that really support inquiry. One is obviously Bruner's work with guided discovery. So this notion, again, of focusing on setting problems and allowing students to discover solutions to different problems. I know there's been some discussion about guided discovery in comparison to inquiry and what might be different. So guided discovery might be trying to discover a particular answer that's correct, whereas inquiry might be a process that generates new problems or new questions to test out different solutions. But they do fall under, you know, the barrier of, you know, this notion of solving problems. I'm not going to talk to meaningful reception learning too much, because I haven't read a lot about it, and I know everyone's going to be shocked at what I just said, and that's a moment you need to capture here. But I haven't read enough about meaningful reception learning to make you know, a good account of it. But there is a link at the end of the presentation where it takes you out to a website where you can read a little bit more about it. But it is a notion where you try, what you're basically trying to do, a bit like constructivism, is try to assimilate new information with what you already know. I think I'm going to talk about constructivism. Is he still gone? So I think we're all kind of aware, because you know, with guided discovery in the 60s and meaningful reception learning in the 60s, what this has morphed into is this notion of constructivist teaching. So constructivist teaching is what I just said. So it's assimilating new information to what we already know. It's multidimensional, so we're learning in a holistic manner. So we're trying to meet the demands of the cognitive, physical, and affective demands of learning, all at the you know, simultaneously and all at the same time. So what we're trying to do is sort of deconstruct problems, reconstruct them in a particular way. So constructivism really gives us you know, an excellent guiding theory for how we move forward when we're talking about inquiry within our classrooms. And you know, it recognizes the importance of that cognition, particularly in physical education, where it supports that you know, learning journey, the learning in the physical. We've got 2 more, so bear with me. Initial teaching models, way back, Jewett, Bain and Ennis put out a book, Curriculum in Physical Education, and they talked about a lot more of a broader models than what we might understand now, you know, with related to you know, the models we have at the bottom of this slide, such as inquiry teaching. But there were some broader curriculum models like humanistic teaching, a humanistic curriculum, physical literacy, a skill themes approach, a movement-based education, and educational gymnastics and dance, which, you know, were apparent in the, you know, 50s, 60s, and 70s within the history of physical education. And these models really had inquiry inbuilt into them, but they provided a platform, as did Jewett, Bain and Ennis's work, for the work that Metzler took forward and given us the 8 models as we know them in his instructional models for physical education text. Now, what Dr. Gleddie and I did was put down some specific models where you would see inquiry. So there is actually an inquiry teaching model in Metzler's book, but we also, and we will do this in this presentation today, we'll talk a little bit about tactical games. and teaching games for understanding, and some practical examples of how inquiry is used in those models. And again, this is because the domain that's prefaced in the learning in those models is the cognitive domain. Similarly, although the cooperative learning model does have really preface learning in the social and the skill learning domain, there is a cognitive component when you're dealing with those group discussions that occur, which are related to principles such as positive interdependence, accountability, face-to-face interaction particularly. The sport education model has phases of inquiry where, teams play games and they have to think through problems that occurred in the game and then think about how they might plan practice. Again, there are social issues that occur within sport education where there might be disagreements about the score or protests between officials. So those are discussions that, or where one team is taking a lead over another team that might be, too many goals. So there are discussions about how we can make playing fair, and those are things that we might see in the sport education model. And then teaching personal responsibility is another model where inquiry is important. And again, that was a model where the face-to-face interaction was important in dealing with conflict, and letting people take turns in giving their opinion on certain things that were happening in the classroom. And then obviously a central thing to inquiry is questioning. I guess a big picture question might be, can I teach through inquiry if I'm not very good at questioning? Well, my answer would be yes, because obviously part of it is framing the problem and coming up with problems for students to inquire into. And obviously it's a process. We get better at questioning the more that we use it. I've been using it in my classes in the higher education standpoint. One thing I've noticed that I do better is when I ask an initial question is I don't accept one-word answers. So if someone, what do we need to do better in the next phase of gameplay? If someone says communicate, I'll say, tell me a little bit more about that. So that would be a probe, because I'm trying to probe for new information in relation to what we mean by communication. Doug Lemoff has got some good resources about how to use questioning in the classroom. He's the practice perfect teacher. And there's a few other issues to consider in questioning. So we put Bloom's taxonomy up here, and this graphic is very useful. I use this to devise my learning outcomes for my classes in a higher education context. So as we see here, we start with knowledge, and go around the circle. And as we get through to the bottom of the circle, evaluation, synthesis, and analysis, we start to get to those deeper, higher order level questions, which are associated, with that level of inquiry that we really want to see students going through when they're looking to solve problems, in our classroom. So knowledge would be sort of recall questions. Did you do this? Did you do that? Whereas the evaluation and synthesis questions might be more open questions. Tell me how you did that. What were some problems you encountered when you did that? So these would be things that get students to think at a deeper level. And I've written a couple of papers where we use Bloom's taxonomy to create question stems for students to move up those levels as you can scaffold them, the questions in your classes. Types of questions. I think Shane Pill talks about the 5 W's. What, why, when, where, and how. And I think the how is the W is the end of the how. There's some basic questions you can think about. So in relation to teaching games for understanding, we talk about the how in relation to skill and movement. So how are you going to get from place A to place B? Where is used in the notion of space. So where are the to you if you have possession of the ball. So these are good ways to sort of start to frame questions, and you can even have students obviously come up with their own questions in class, and again, by doing this type of inquiry and setting up those problems, students will create questions and you'll be able to write them down on your piece of paper. Another thing that's important in questioning is using wait time. As I've talked about on a previous Phys Ed Summit presentation, the longer teachers wait for an answer. So if you wait longer than 3 to 5 seconds, you're more likely to get an answer. Doug Lemov's work would suggest that you might not want to get the tumbleweed going in class, and you should cut straight to the chase with your question and be very specific about it. But still, you know, the notion of giving people time to listen to the question and try and process it is important. He uses strategies such as cold calling. So if you then have wait time and there is no answer, you might say, right, Sarah, you tell us something that you were thinking in relation to this. Right, Johnny, what were you thinking? So that's a way of, you know, still giving wait time, but making sure the flow of the lesson is quite quick, because that's a complaint with this inquiry mode, is that we don't get enough physical activity. But there is a way in which you can use questioning so it's productive in the classroom. And then, like I say, at the end, you can use probes. Probes are used for clarification. I gave you an example about communication. Can you tell me what you mean by that? It might be a probe for new information. We've talked about we've talked about the importance of communication, and we've said this and this. Are there any other things that we feel communication is important for? And it can also be used to redirect flow. You might see students having a non-productive conversation. And so what you may do is go up as a teacher and ask a question to redirect the flow away from some sort of negativity and defensive statements where students try and, you know, defend something that we're doing in gameplay as an outcome. And you might just want to, you know, flip the switch and give them that opportunity. So obviously, for questions to be effective, they need to be planned. Like Shane Pearl was saying in the presentation between 7 and 8 today, you do need to have a plan, but you don't need to necessarily stick rigidly to it. So if you have 5 questions written down on a piece of paper, you might not ask them exactly how they're written down, but because you've gone through the process of trying to create those questions and put them on your lesson plan, you've got that as a fallback and a guideline. So that is that little section. I know the questioning is something that people find really intriguing. So are there any questions at this time coming from the Tozzle or anything?
There are not yet.
Must be just so awesome. Right, move on. Right, this is Seth.
One thing that I'm horrible at, like whenever I'm doing any presentation, is I don't introduce myself ever. So I realized that we didn't go through that process. So hopefully as each of us speak, we just introduce ourselves. I'm Seth Martin. I teach elementary physical education in South Lake Tahoe, just so you know kind of where I'm at. As far as adding inquiry into lessons, I think this is a process that a lot of people, the hardest time with the starting point, how to do it, and even figuring out how to approach it. And I think before even getting into any of these bullet points, biggest thing to remember is it's going to be sloppy, and it can be sloppy, and it can be a messy process. The smoother it will get, and then completely fail. And you've just got to understand that in the end, the process is discovering, you know, and giving them opportunities. And sometimes you thought, and it turned out you weren't. And reflection, if you don't reflect with this whole inquiry model, be successful with it. Just like really any good teaching, be finding your outcome before anything else. And really you're thinking about the students to discover, or what do you want them to be able to explain and understand, and what do you want them to find strategies for. And you need to think through why that would be. It's a matter of looking at the levels of complexity point in that process. Whether they're defensive strategies in invasion games, whether you're looking at, you know, covering your court in net and wall games, why X, Y, or Z. And once you know that point, then you can start building out from there. pieces that has helped me goes back to a presentation Andy Hare did on essential questions. Great sessions. And even before that, Mel actually got me going on an inquiry-based model because her first presentation for the PE Summit was inquiry-based teaching. It was TGFU rolling, but really looking for that main question. You know, how do you advance the ball up the field in an invasion game? Looking at what that big concept is that the students are going to be discovering their key strategies or their key pieces too. And once you know what you want them building, creating an experience that hopefully will help them get there. The way that you think, no, well, the questions always go that way. No, but if you reflect on it, really think about what your big goal is, take them to that. And I think this kind of falls into a little bit of guided inquiry. You can also mix in some free inquiry, like as you're going along, adding in, okay, what are you wondering about with invasion games in general? Or what are you wondering about in moving the ball forward? But creating that initial activity. So what's the first activity? How is it going to be structured? How is that going to then build from there? And an activity where you want offensive strategies to move to the forefront, do you set it up so that an advantage? You know, how are you going to set it up to hopefully get the students to start discovering strategies that get them there? Because you can start at 3 versus 3, but then you have to think about you go next, because that initial activity is going to be really where the ball starts rolling and you start questioning from there. And extend that. Are you going to move from 3 against 1 to 3 against 2 or 3 on 3? How are you going to extend it out? And then also you're going to think about the high achievers and how are you going to challenge the students who are still struggling. Those students come along too, because in the end you need all the students to go through that process and go through that discovery, whether they're your highest level athletes or whether they're, you know, the student who just is starting the journey, and creating scaffolding to where the students can self-pace a little bit about where they're going to go next. And I think that those secondary questions are huge, as was mentioned, having those extra questions built in, but then watching the groups and interacting with the groups and really going group by group and seeing what their struggles are, or student by student, what their processes are that then, you know, move them forward, or, you know, that needs to be thought about more, or that even needs to be restructured so that they can. And Jorge, would you like to add anything into the process? So all of this, again, you could go class by class, and each class is doing a different basically through, and one class might and really make strong discoveries. The next class, it just doesn't work for them. And you have to understand that that's part of this model, is looking at your students, looking at that group, and then trying to move forward with it, as opposed to, you know, as, well, this lesson didn't work for this group, what's wrong with this group? It's really a reflection on, okay, what about this group do I need to think about for the next lesson? And basically then, you know, looking at, okay, what's the next step for this group? What's the next that we need of strategies? Are they ready to move to defense? Basically, where are we going to go next? Again, Jorge, are you in there? Do you want to add anything in as far as that goes, or slide?
Nope, sounds good. So the next slide. So let me introduce myself. My name is Jorge Rodriguez, and I'm a PE teacher at Harvard Elementary in Houston. And so I wanted to quickly talk about an inquiry cycle that I like to use, and something that I'm really going to focus on this year. And going back to what Dr. Harvey said, and really planning out those questions. And so Kath Murdoch's inquiry cycle is a pretty good one that I've been kind of exposed to And I think it's pretty simple to understand and kind of easy to use. And I also think it lends itself really well to the different teaching models, like teaching games for understanding. So when we go through the unit, so for instance, if we're doing a target games unit, as an example of a category in teaching games for understanding, as we go through, I like to try to plan out different experiences for each of the different parts of the inquiry cycle. So the tuning in part, what do you know about the activity? What do you know about the topic that we're talking about? That could also lend itself really well to the first part of teaching games for understanding, which would be starting off with a game. So having the kids kind of create a game based on the principles of a target game, and just kind of getting familiarized with that process, and then moving on to finding out how could you find out more about the particular topic. I think that kind of lends itself also really well in the tactical games approach to game appreciation. So they're getting to know the activity, and that's also a good way to kind of scaffold your activities as well, so the kids can fully understand the rules of the game, the boundaries of the game, and so forth. And then moving on to sorting out the information that they have found out. So through trial and error, what is working, what's not working, and that to me also kind of lends itself really well to the tactical awareness process in teaching games for understanding. So figuring out questions to ask your students about how about their offensive and defensive strategies, and then having them kind of think through it, communicate with their partner or group, and then sort out what's going to work offensively and what's going to work defensively. And then like Seth was kind of alluding to as well, with the different scenarios and things that could play a part in this sorting out process. So, for instance, if you're playing a net and wall game, and you're tied 24-24, and you have to win by 2. Well, how is that going to change your offensive and defensive strategy? So let's say you're up by 10. It's 10-20, and you're up by 10 games to 25. How is that going to change your offensive and defensive strategies? So taking a look at that, and again, having the kids be able to communicate with their group of partners is really important in the sorting out process. And then going further, going further and making conclusions. I think kind of looking at the teaching games for understanding model, I think that kind of lends itself well to making appropriate decisions and the skill execution part of it. And then, of course, the performance and TGFU and then taking action, I think, kind of go hand in hand, where you think about, you kind of think about it a little bit more broadly in teaching games for understanding. I always kind of try to ask my kids, how are how is the tactical complexity of a certain game or category, how can that translate to something else? Maybe in another category, maybe another game, maybe even outside of the sports realm. And I think that's the same kind of thing with taking action, where you kind of have your kids start thinking about what they've learned and how that can help them or others, and start thinking about how this would translate into like a real world situation. All right, Seth.
Yeah, and I think too, like with the lesson planning, I think it's a matter of planning to ask questions, but I think one of the huge pieces is, and this was something that Mel even shared presentations to individual groups rather than stopping everybody. So allowing people to continue their discovery without too many interruptions. I will build in, I'll have questions that I have listed out, but I'll go group to group versus going whole groups. So not stopping the whole class throughout the lesson, but instead making sure to have opportunities where you can go group to group and ask those groups questions. Because if you have a group that's, then their question might be something to push them forward. Struggling, it's a question to get them to kind of think through occurring. And then if that struggle is shared, then doing a whole group when you go into your lesson for that. you want to ask a question, you just structure it so that you stop class repeatedly. You do it at a little bit more of a group by group level. Prepared for that in your lesson versus stopping the whole group. And I think one of the things that's important is in the lesson, it can be a part of your closure, but it's not closure. Like it shouldn't be at the end of the lesson. It should be going on throughout, and that going on throughout the whole lesson. And whether it's a small group or a whole group, that process should be going on from start to finish, not then walking away from the whole activity because it won't have the value. Unit plans, Jorge and I have both been talking about, look at, going from least to most complex concepts. So a big complex concept and you haven't built, like, how do you get open? If they don't understand that and you're asking, how do you effectively pass? It's a bigger idea that they're missing, and you end up going backwards in the lesson, or you just won't have success. So really looking at those pieces that are the least complex and building up to the most complex. At the elementary level, that means kind of going along with a spiraling curriculum where third grade students might be approaching very basic invasion game ideas, whereas you get to your fourth and fifth grade students and now you're starting to dig a little bit deeper. And obviously as you get into middle school and high school students, those concepts get more complex. Background knowledge that has been built in the past. And same thing with, net and wall games, starting with very simple tasks and activities, and building up to more complex games with more moving parts and moving pieces and even more pieces of equipment. So really thinking through, whereas if you're starting your net and wall games with your younger students, you're not starting with a net and wall game that requires, a paddle and a ball, or a paddle and a birdie, and trying to cover space and trying to get it over a net. All those pieces could be overwhelming, and how do I cover my court may never come about. Through, how you're going to build that up over time, and then grade by grade, how each essential question builds into each other, and obviously being prepared to modify it as your students show you where they're at, which is our second bullet. So just being ready to constantly based on even class to class or those whole groups. If you really want to kind of commit to that concept, I've seen teachers who've been trying to do inquiry where all of a sudden they start talking about when the essential question was offensive based and they're trying to fix what's going on defense. And, that's got to be the focal point of that day. You can kind of mention it, or if you see good strategies, point them out. But if you jump around strategies, then it's been confusing. And instead of doing that, really try to stick to whatever your goal was, or whatever the essential question or the main thought out of that lesson, and not trying to have 5 different ideas being addressed in the same lesson, because that can be overwhelming for your students. And then obviously throughout the whole lesson, and then obviously throughout your whole planning, reflect, revisit, and revise that plan and keep changing it, and even come back to it later in the year and build off of it. One of the things that I've started realizing is that I can also use the target games as a way to also kind of fine tune some skills that the students might need to use. So I can use other stories in a way to build skill, and even to, just set up students for success later on. And also really realizing the importance of following those, going from target games to, net and wall, striking and fielding, to invasion, and why those different levels are so important. And even through my invasion units, starting with invading with just the body is, you're invading space without an implement, and then building into the implements being involved, so that, the passing of a ball, comes after they've realized how to avoid a defender, how to avoid somebody who's trying to catch them, things like that.
And I just wanted to kind of add a little bit to, you're talking about the complexity and increasing complexity. That's something that I did last year that I found a lot of success with my kids, where I started with target games, and it was start there and kind of it's almost like a closed setting where the kids can practice their overhand serve, not overhand serve, I'm sorry, like an overhand throw, um, and they're only really concerned about a target, and there's no defender that they have to worry about. There's no they don't have to throw it in a certain amount of time. And then once we left that category and went to like striking and fielding, well, now they have to throw it with a little bit more accuracy to get it to their fielder, and then also think about how to get the quickest out possible. So you're adding in complexity, but they're still developing that skill. And of course, you get to net and wall games. There's a whole other, like Seth was saying, there's a net that you have to get over now and that kind of thing. And then in invasion games, now there's a lot of different tactical analysis that you have to make and include that overhand throw. So it's a great way to kind of give them different scenarios throughout the categories that build in complexity while you're still reinforcing that basic skill. So that's really cool. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how I'm at an IB school, and so one of the things that we do to incorporate inquiry into our IB planners, into our units, is we kind of take a really broad concept. So we have these transdisciplinary themes, and for this example, we use sharing the planet. And then from there, we have a central idea that's going to kind of it's going to be kind of the overarching theme of the unit. And for this particular one, it's citizens demonstrate rights and responsibilities to belong to communities. Now, this isn't necessarily, actually, the central idea shouldn't be specific to a certain subject. It should be broad enough that it'll be true regardless of subject, regardless the environment that you're in. And then from that central idea, we write lines of inquiry that will help kind of guide the lessons. So those are 3 lines of inquiry that we kind of, as a specialty team, kind of came up with. Community-involved responsibility, behaviors strengthen relationships within community, and then communities help inform rights. So these are also, you can change these to questions as provocation questions for your students as well. So as a student, as a kid, what rights do you have? How does your community inform those rights? And that's something that the kids can start thinking about. And that also kind of reflects Shape America Standard 4, where they're thinking about their personal responsibility and social behaviors in respect to physical activity. So, like I said, I just wanted to touch on that briefly to kind of these are I think this is a great way to also kind of think about inquiry and how it could go from like a really broad transdisciplinary theme or a broad anchoring idea, and then get a little bit more specific. So at this point, does anybody have any questions?
We just got 2 really big ones from Charlie Rizzuto in the Tassel. So he asks, do you find that using this approach to questioning also enhances the quality and quantity of the questions the students ask you and their classmates? Do you find that students really start to dig deeper with the concept and through that work spark their own curiosity to find out more when you use this approach?
So, I mean, if I could say
I'll jump in real fast and just say, definitely, I feel like my student engagement has increased tremendously. I have a population of students who would be classified as EL learners, and they still want to be a part of the conversation. 4 kids raise their hand scenario goes away, and it becomes a conversation. And setting up chances for them to have conversations is a lot easier. And they do start pulling out questions, and even that is a little bit more in depth. I had a student, stuff that she knew, but she wouldn't share just because, the conversation wasn't there, of, looking for passing lanes. So bringing in vocabulary that a lot of these students aren't familiar with, all the other students, improve their knowledge.
So if I could add a little bit to that, I think it definitely increases engagement, like Seth was saying, and I think it does allow the students to go a little bit deeper in their learning. And like Dr. Harvey was saying with the constructivist approach, it's a really powerful thing when you have students, you know, communicating their thoughts to other students, and having like opposing ideas, and then having that opportunity to come together, share their thoughts, articulate their thoughts on what's going on, and then create new learning that way. I think that's really, really powerful, and I think it helps create that environment in your class where kids learn to communicate with each other, learn to respect each other's ideas, and then it creates a more cohesive environment for learning. So yeah, I think these techniques aren't only just for the sake of learning, but also for creating a more respectful and cohesive environment where the kids can communicate, take risks, and then go deeper in their learning. All right, you want to move on to the next one here?
I think these are my slides here. Hi, I'm Mel Hamada and I teach and all the people for sharing your time, guys. The next 3 slides are from me, and I'm not going to go through them in any detail because I know time is precious, but I will follow on from what Jorge was saying about maybe instead of using just game concept questions, which are awesome, but you can align them with core values from your school. So if your school is an IB school or have its own particular lines of inquiry or values, my school in the middle school does not do IB or another, it has its own standards-based work depending on subject. But our school itself has identified the core values that it would like to work with, and so we use those as part of our inquiry line. And if you look at the next slide, the next 2 slides sort of show some progressional thinking around that if you're interested in the way that we've structured that as a vertical alignment. And similarly to what Jorge has put up about community, this is a community approach. So if you look at your invasion games inquiry focus as an ongoing evolution and hierarchy, at the beginning you might just be focusing on passing and moving. And so for me, the passing and moving part is about what's my role and what's my responsibility in this community. I need to pass this way, I need to move over here, I need to create space here. And then by the time we get to grade 10, we're really looking at, okay, we've covered that. We know what our responsibilities are. And now we want to go into more depth about what are the challenges that are facing our community. And they might be tactical, they might be skill-based, or they might be collaborative-based, or it might be personal skill that's causing a concern in the community. So a lot of the work that I do is about how to scaffold that inquiry so that it's growing vertically. And if you have a continuum from 1 being the most basic inquiry into invasion and 10 being the most complex, it's about scaffolding that through that vertical alignment. And I always start with number 1, watching the kids, but I might find that for grade 6s, I spend an hour looking at this particular basic moving and passing concept. And in grade 10, I spend 5 minutes on it. And it's just progressional and quick differentiation through that inquiry line. I'm going to jump on to assessment, if that's okay with you, Jorge. So a lot of people often ask me, how are you assessing this? And I'll just put the link in to one of the documents. If you go to the observational skills, what I've done is just looked at through that hierarchy of development for invasion. I have a look at whether they can actually do it in each of the little inquiry setups that I've put together, just like we might do if we were playing games. And as they progressionally go through those, I just tick them off. And that I'll spend my whole unit doing that and writing comments and making notes and maybe go with videos with kids. And I've color coded them because I'm a bit of a color OCD person, and they go with different standards. So for me, this is about, you know, really watching what kids are doing and engaging. If I can see that they feel on the student self-assessment that they are, you know, doing all of those things, then we might need to go back and have a look at the video or pull them out and get them to watch what they see. So there's some information for people who are interested in those. The second document that I've put together is just a solo rubric for invasion that goes along the same lines. For a chance to just double check that I've shared that correctly. it will give people a chance to see how sorry, can you refresh that? I want to check that. How I get the kids to break down and looking at different skills and game sense approaches, as well as those core values that we were inquiring into. There's a lot of information there, and if people want to follow up with me, you're very welcome to. Doug, I think it's you.
Okay, hello everybody. Sorry for not being able to get on right away. I had to reboot my computer. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Excellent. So I'm up in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and I'll briefly mention assessment piece before going further, but when I was still a teacher and not a teacher of teachers, I used a flag football unit where the whole thing was based on inquiry, and they started with pairs, figuring out how to move, just as Seth mentioned earlier, starting with those basic skills. How do you move your body into spaces? What are good ways of catching and receiving a football? And they started to make plays, and the assessment at the end was actually their playbook. So they went from singles to pairs to then teams of 4, and we played 4-on-4, and they had to write plays, refine plays, and their final kind of assignment from that unit was the hand-in of their actual playbook, but also with the rationale of why they changed plays, why they used them. So it was an inquiry process from start to finish. I'll just then talk very briefly. I don't think we can talk about inquiry without talking about teacher inquiry. And however you want to talk about that, whether it's inquiry, reflection, or practitioner research, there's lots of ways to do that. I can share a link, a couple of links to some different pieces later, but one of the key things too, and Sean talks about reflection in action and reflection on action. So I did share, and you'll get it in the Google Doc afterwards, but what are some questions to ask during the lesson of yourself? So, are your students working safely? Are your students on task? If students are not on task, do you need to change the focus for the entire class or just for individuals? And then after the lesson, of course, reflecting back and forth in terms of what works. Did the students actually learn? And when you're doing an inquiry, were they authentically inquiring? What were the questions like? Do I need to change them next time? So there's lots of stuff to consider, but I really feel strongly that if you're doing an inquiry model with your students, you have to be the lead inquirer, and you have to model some of that and really demonstrate what that looks like. And I mentioned in the comments on the TOZL just that creating a culture of inquiry so students know that it's okay to stop and ask questions. And often we feel that, okay, I've got 30, 40 minutes for phys ed, they have to be moving the whole time. But phys ed is not only about moving. We need time for social, we need time for this, because we're talking about the entire thinking, feeling, moving individual. So I talked too fast, but that's okay.
Okay, so any questions out there?
No, there's not any questions right now, but it is generating some really, really good conversation. People have been talking a lot about the question starters that you posted, Stephen.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if that's something you want to go a little more depth in, or the purpose and why they're so beneficial to teachers.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're first starting out, it's like we all want something to hang our hat on, right? So, if you go there with a blank slate, you can use the 5 W's like I talked about, but I think the other thing is what you want to try and do is match the question with level that the student's at. So you're sort of scaffolding their learning. So it might be early on in the inquiry process, some of the question starters might be around sort of knowledge and comprehension. And then there's another document there, Metzler's questioning document. So he has a couple of, quite short questions like, did you do this? Did you do that? And that's sort of knowledge and comprehension type of questions. But then obviously with the question starters, you start to get into different things like what do you see? So like this has got analyzing. So what qualities or characteristics? So it might be, what qualities and characteristics does someone need to be to play on the defensive line, or in the football example, or in the offensive line. So I think those are the types of questions you can build off the question starters. And that would, Shane Pill talked about learning intentions in Australia. I don't know if they've moved that to that in Canada, but you can match the questions to the learning intentions you have for your students. So as you go through the unit, what you should start to see is, you will get some more of those like evaluation synthesis questions being dealt with, for the majority of the students. So if I just sort of take another look at this, another example. So drawing conclusions and inferring consequences. So if you changed X, what might happen? So if you pass the ball here, or if that person ran there, what would you do in that scenario, right? So these are, I know I use sort of game-based examples, but the things that the question starters can do for you, you can use them to pick 2 or 3 or 4 questions that you can put on your lesson plan. So you're not going in there with your, into sort of a dark room with no lights. You've actually got things you can draw on. And what you tend to find is as you start to ask the question, you'll get a response, and then you can use your probes to build off that, especially when you get good at recognizing, well, does that need, do I need to redirect the flow? Do I need to build new knowledge here? Do I need to sort of challenge and question to elicit more information about something? So I think the question starters are just something that, I've advocated for, especially for teachers who are new to this approach, because, I think that that's one thing that maybe scares them. And the other thing is the low physical activity. And then the other thing is the assessment. So those are things I think that we shouldn't worry too much about, because there are lots of resources out there that can be helpful.
So we have another question from the Tazzle that says, at what age should we start doing this? The teacher's concerned that if she started too young, she would be overwhelming the young students. And I think one of the best ways to describe inquiry to a teacher who's learning about it is maybe give an example question that you would ask like a kindergartner, and then give an example of a question that you would ask a 5th grader, so that they could see the difference in complexity.
Yeah, go on.
This was something that I learned from watching one of Andy Hare's sessions, and it's bringing in that inquiry. So with my kindergartners, we'll work on volleying a balloon. I'm asking them how do they keep the balloon in the air, and how do they hold their body, or how do they use their body parts, and what do they have to do with their body to keep that thing in the air? Very simple questions, but to the point where they're actually starting to describe what later on would be a volleyball set. They want to keep the balloon in the air, or then trying to get them to move around. And how do you get the balloon to move forward? So those kind of rather simple questions, but really starting them young, because it's actually, in my experience when I started doing this model, it was harder to get the kids to transition to inquiry, do it when they were young. It's been much easier after starting with the younger students to get them there. And then with 5th grade students, it might be, how do you advance the ball? A defender is or taller than you. So what things are you doing to deal with that struggle?
Yeah, and I think for me, it's one of those urban myths. I don't know if Dr. Gleddie or Doug would agree. It's a bit of an urban legend that you can't teach inquiry to young students. And I think Seth made a really good point that, if you start young, and just like Metzler advocates, if you're using preschool or elementary, you sort of frame the problem or the task very clearly. You have explicit expectations, like we would do anything, and you possibly limit the, the comprehension level of the question. So is it recall question? Is it a knowledge question? And you save the sort of real high order ones, as Seth just described. As the kids get older, you can start to use question starters that are more commensurate with their level of learning. So you are scaffolding. My last point, because I know someone else might want to chime in, is Metzler is very clear on in that document I posted about having questions that are thinking questions and questions that are moving questions. So a question to get them to think might be, describe 3 elements that are useful for you to be able to throw the ball from A to B. And other questions might be, can you show me something? And I think we use that again in TGFU. Here's a problem. Can you now go play and show me? And I think that's just important, really, because again, it's not all of standing around talking all the time. It's, the people actually get the opportunity to go and perform and show you through their performance that they kind of have some level of comprehension of different tasks that are being put forward.
So I wanted to say something real quick as well. I think with some of the questions as well, you could ask the same question to different levels, and then just kind of prompt them to elaborate on their response. So, for instance, a ready position. Like, I think in pretty much every category of games and in various situations, you can ask them, how should you be standing to receive the ball or to anticipate the ball? And every kid can show you from a pre-K 4-year-old to a 12th grader. They can show you what their representation of ready position would be, and then, like Seth was saying, you just increase in complexity about as to why you're standing that certain way, or how to balance or shift your weight and so on. So I think like Dr. Harvey was saying, any student can kind of show you that. It's just where you go from there.
I think if I jump in for a second, I put on the TOZL that it's about building that culture of inquiry. And when you start it young, like both Seth and Stephen said, it does help. And I think especially if you're someone who's privileged to teach, say, K to 5 all the way through for kids, you see them grow and learn. And when you teach them that next year and you teach them that next year, they get to know that it's okay. The biggest thing that I find with the questioning is, and Carrie mentioned this on the TOZL too, but is just giving them that time to think and recognizing that time is valuable. And, you have to provide, as teachers, we want to give the answers, but that's not effective. If they find the answers for themselves, it's so much more effective, but it does take time.
Okay, so we are really cutting short on time. We went a little long, which I think is a good thing. And I just want to thank everybody for tuning in. And I also want to thank our presenters, Doug, Mel, Jorge, Seth, and Stephen, for informing us a little bit more about inquiry. Couple reminders: if you go to the PhysEdOG website and you go to the PhysEd Summit page, you can access the certificate of participation in case you need to print that for your professional development hours. And also, there is a possibility that you can continue the conversation and continue asking questions that you have for the presenters through Voxer. And Jorge might be able to set that up through Voxcast, which is a podcast that he created and is always pushing out new episodes of. So thank you so much.